be shown. Somewhere in a CBS vault, for more than 5 decades, there sat 25 minutes of black and white film that almost nobody was allowed to see. It wasn't destroyed. It wasn't lost in a fire or eaten by time. It was simply pulled quietly and deliberately and kept out of every rerun package, every syndication deal, and every home video release that followed. Fans of the show it belonged didn't even know it existed until bootleg copies started circulating among collectors decades later. That show was The Twilight Zone, and the episode was called The Encounter. Today we're going to talk about why a single episode of a beloved sci-fi anthology became too dangerous to broadcast, what it actually says about America, and why, after a full 55 years in the dark, it's finally allowed to be seen again. Let's set the scene. The Twilight Zone premiered on CBS in October of 1959, and it wasn't like anything else on the air. There was no continuing cast, no ongoing plot. Every week was a fresh nightmare, a fresh moral puzzle, a fresh little universe built and dismantled in a single half hour. The connective tissue holding it all together was the voice of Rod Serling, the show's creator, who wrote or co-wrote the overwhelming majority of its episodes and narrated nearly all of them with that unmistakable clipped, deliberate cadence. Serling had served in the Pacific during World War II as a paratrooper, and the things he saw there never really left him. He came home angry. Not loud angry, but the quiet kind that simmers under a calm exterior. Angry at bigotry, at Cold War paranoia, at the way American television flinched from anything resembling real controversy. That anger had already cost him once. In 1956, Serling wrote a teleplay inspired by the murder of Emmett Till, a black teenager lynched in Mississippi. By the time network standards and practices editors and nervous sponsors finished stripping it down, the victim had been changed into an unnamed foreigner, and the setting had been scrubbed of anything that might upset a Southern affiliate. Serling was furious, and that fury became fuel. The Twilight Zone was, in many ways, his workaround. If you dress a story about McCarthyism up as an alien invasion, or a story about nuclear terror as a suburban bomb shelter drama, sponsors were far less likely to flinch, and the message could sneak past the censors disguised as pulp entertainment. It worked more often than not. But even Serling's ingenious camouflage had its limits, and nowhere did those limits show more clearly than in the story we're focused on today. The Encounter aired just once, on May 1st, 1964, as the 31st episode of the show's 5th and final season. It's worth pausing on an important detail here. Unlike most of the series' best-remembered episodes, this one wasn't written by Serling himself. The teleplay came from writer Martin M. Goldsmith, and it was directed by Robert Butler. It's a bottle episode in the truest sense. Almost the entire runtime plays out in one stifling, cluttered attic, with only 2 actors carrying the weight of the story. Those 2 actors were Neville Brand, playing a World War II veteran named Fenton, and a young George Takei, 2 years before he became a household name as Sulu on Star Trek, playing a Japanese-American man who arrives at Fenton's house looking for gardening work. What begins as an awkward but civil exchange over a shared beer curdles quickly. While rummaging through boxes, Fenton digs up a samurai sword and admits, with visible discomfort, that he took it off a Japanese soldier during the war, a soldier he killed. It becomes clear, after 55 years, this banned Twilight Zone episode can finally wipe credible evidence of mass disloyalty among Japanese-American communities during the war. Not one act of sabotage was ever traced back to an interned Japanese-American. The internment was built on fear and racial prejudice, not fact. And in 1964, the country had barely begun to publicly grapple with that truth. For The Encounter, to put those exact words in the mouth of its only Japanese-American character, confirming the myth rather than confronting it, felt to many viewers less like brave storytelling and more like a wound reopened on national television. There's a layer to this that makes the episode even harder to sit with, and it's a layer involving George Takei himself. Takei wasn't just playing a role that touched on internment. He had lived it. As a 5-year-old boy in Los Angeles, he and his family were forced from their home after Pearl Harbor and sent to an internment camp in Arkansas, one of 10 such facilities the U.S. government built to hold Japanese-American citizens during the war. He would later describe soldiers with rifles marching his family out of their own house, and the surreal, frightening experience of growing up behind barbed wire for a crime that was never committed and never charged. Decades later, Takei became one of the most visible public advocates for keeping that history from being forgotten, writing about it extensively and helping create the Broadway musical Allegiance, which he called one of the most personally important projects of his career. So the actor delivering the line about his character's traitor father was someone who understood, in his own bones, exactly what that myth had cost real families like his own. Whatever the writers intended, that context adds a strange, uncomfortable weight to every scene he's in. Facing a wave of backlash from Japanese-American advocacy groups and general viewer complaints, and airing at a moment when American anxiety about Asia was already climbing as the country deepened its involvement in Vietnam, CBS made a decision. Rather than defend the episode or let the controversy play out, the network simply pulled The Encounter from its syndication package. When The Twilight Zone entered the endless cycle of reruns that would define its afterlife for the next 50-plus years, local station reruns, cable marathons, VHS box sets, DVD collections, this one episode was conspicuously, permanently absent. It holds a genuinely unique distinction in television history. Of the show's 156 original episodes, it's the only one that was formally withheld from syndication entirely. For most of 2 generations, if you wanted to see it, your only option was a battered bootleg tape traded quietly among hardcore collectors, or word-of-mouth stories about the episode CBS didn't want anyone to watch. That finally changed on January 3rd, 2016, when Sci-Fi, which had taken over broadcast rights to the classic series, aired The Encounter as part of its New Year's marathon of Twilight Zone episodes, more than 51 years after the original and only broadcast. There was no fanfare, no official statement explaining the decision, just the episode quietly slotted back into rotation as if the intervening half-century hadn't happened. Since then, it has become available on streaming platforms as part of the complete series and included in home video collections, meaning that for the first time in the show's history, all 156 episodes exist in reasonably equal circulation. What was once the show's forbidden chapter is now just another entry you can queue up on a Tuesday night. So why does an episode this narrow in scope, 1 room, 2 men, 25 minutes, a haunting short film adapted from Ambrose Bierce's Civil War-era story, was actually a French production that CBS had licensed to air only once as a kind of experimental special episode, and true to that agreement, it largely disappeared from view for years afterward, despite having won an Academy Award. None of those disappearances involved the same kind of public moral reckoning The Encounter did. They were tangled up in contracts and copyright rather than protest letters. But together, they're a reminder that the version of The Twilight Zone most of us grew up watching in reruns was never quite the complete picture. Entire pieces of it were missing, and most viewers never even knew to look for them. It's tempting to file The Encounter away as a strange artifact of a less enlightened television era and move on. But the discomfort at the center of the episode, a country deciding in real time who gets to be trusted and who gets treated as a permanent suspect based on how they look, hasn't exactly disappeared. In the years since the COVID-19 pandemic began, the U.S. saw a well-documented spike in harassment and violence targeting Asian Americans, often rooted in exactly the same kind of reflexive suspicion that fueled internment 8 decades earlier. The idea that people can be treated as foreign threats regardless of their citizenship, their history, or their actual conduct. The U.S. government didn't formally apologize for Japanese-American internment until 1988, when President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which explicitly acknowledged that the policy had been driven by race prejudice and wartime hysteria rather than any real national security threat. Survivors received a formal apology and modest reparations, but no signature on a bill of race is what an entire community actually lived through, and it certainly doesn't guarantee the same instincts won't resurface under new circumstances and against new targets. That's ultimately what makes The Encounter worth revisiting now rather than treating it as a museum piece. It's not a comfortable episode, and it was never trying to be. It puts a war veteran's unprocessed guilt and a young man's inherited trauma in the same small room, and refuses to let either character or the audience off the hook. Whether CBS was right to pull it in 1964 is still genuinely debated among people who study the show. There's a real argument that suppressing it denied audiences a chance to actually wrestle with a difficult piece of history. An equally real argument that the episode's central premise did more harm than good by giving oxygen to a myth that had already caused so much damage. Both of those things can be true at once. And the fact that this one is still being argued about more than 60 years later says something about how unresolved the questions underneath it really are. The Twilight Zone itself has never really gone away. Jordan Peele rebooted the anthology for CBS All Access in 2019, bringing its social commentary instincts into a very different media landscape, and Sorling's original script continue to circulate in new formats, from stage adaptations to anniversary reissues. But it's this 1 hour of television, the hour almost nobody was allowed to watch for 55 years, that keeps forcing its way back into conversation, precisely because it never offered anyone an easy way out. An attic, a sword, two men who can't quite look each other in the eye, and a country that still hasn't entirely figured out what to do with its own history. That's the episode CBS tried to bury. And that's exactly why, all these decades later, it's still worth watching. Thanks for reading. If you found this deep dive interesting, there's a lot more Twilight Zone history worth digging into, and this is far from the only episode